Good afternoon. We are going to start the meeting. We've been running a few minutes late. My name is Stella Ndirangu. I am the moderator for this webinar discussion. And thank you so much for joining us, all of you, as we run this discussion today as we mark the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict, trying to devise strategies on how we can overcome the legacies of sexual violence in South Sudan. So before we start, I think let's run through a few ground rules of how this webinar will be run. We will have an introduction session after this, and then after that, we will run a number of questions to the panelists, which I will pose to them and they will answer, which will run for about 40 minutes. Once we are done with the panel discussion, we will open up this session to a plenary session. When we are having the plenary session, there are a number of options as to how you can raise your questions, seek clarifications from the panelists. The first one would be if you can raise your hand. There's a raise hand option within this platform. So if you can raise up your hand, we will allow you to pose your question. And then there's the other option of you typing your question. You can type the question as the session is going on. And then we will post that question to the panelists when we get to the plenary session. After the plenary session, we will close the meeting with a closing word from all the panelists. And so overall, what we are hoping is that we will run this meeting for 1.5 hours. So by 3:30, we will be closing the meeting. So we will take questions that will fit into the context of the time frame for this meeting. Thank you. So to start us off, I would like to just give a brief introduction to why we thought this webinar was timely and relevant for the South Sudan conflict, because many of us know that the South Sudan has seen a wide-scale perpetration of serious crimes during the conflicts that it has had, different conflicts it has had. In the last couple of years, we've seen serious crimes which have included murder, abduction, torture, forced displacement, forced recruitment of even children into the conflict. We've also seen destruction of property. But one particular crime that has been very pervasive, prevalent, and endemic in South Sudan has been actually sexual violence in its various forms against the South Sudanese women and girls, and in certain instances against other people of other nationalities that are residing in South Sudan. And so because of this, we've seen also sexual violence being classified, even by the UN Commission, as being used as a weapon of war against by the different parties to the conflict. And so we thought today, on the day that we mark the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict globally, it's important we take an opportunity to this opportunity to reflect as a sector that is working on these issues, but also as people who are concerned about the human rights and accountability for crimes that have been committed in South Sudan and continue to be committed in South Sudan. And so today we will not only be discussing sexual violence that was committed during the conflict, but we're discussing, has the situation changed? If sexual violence is continuing even in this transition period, what best strategies can we deploy to ensure that we start dealing with these legacies of sexual violence against South Sudanese women and girls primarily? And so for this, we have been joined by 4 amazing women who work in the field of human rights, and in particular on protecting women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence in South Sudan. 3 of them are South Sudanese, but one of them is joining us from Uganda, and she's an expert, has worked on South Sudan, but has also worked on the Northern Uganda situation context, and also other contexts where there's been conflicts in this region. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panel of speakers, beginning with Jackline Nasiwa, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice. And Jackline has a passion for promoting gender inclusion and protecting the rights of women and children. And she's a strong advocate for effective deployment of transitional justice and good governance. Then also joining us today is Josephine Chandiru, who is the director, executive director at Stewart Women, which is a local South Sudanese organization. And she has been involved a lot in ensuring that access to justice is strengthened for women and girls, and her organization has worked primarily in trying to ensure that there are mobile courts justice is reaching the remote areas in South Sudan. She's participated in a lot of and engaged government institutions in trying to strengthen their response towards access to justice. Then we have Aluel Atem. Aluel is a development economist, but also is a feminist, and she has a keen interest on gender and conflict transformation. She believes in change, and she believes in change, and not only limited to offline, but in-person engagement. And she utilizes every space that she occupies to initiate and challenge narratives that reinforce gender stereotypes. Aluel globally facilitates trainings on conflict transformation skills and coaches and mentors other trainers and facilitators. And then we have Sarah Kihika Kasande, who is the head of office of the Uganda Office for the International Center for Transitional Justice, ICTJ, better known as ICTJ. Sarah is an advocate, and she is a human rights lawyer with quite extensive experience working in the field of human rights and transitional justice. She has provided technical advice and capacity support to a broad range of transitional justice themes to state and non-state actors. And I'm pleased to say that I've worked with Sarah for quite a number of years in this sector. And so with having introduced the panelists, we will now move to the plenary session by the panelists, where the panelists will will inform us about the current situation in South Sudan and what practices and lessons we can carry with us as we continue to agitate and advocate for accountability for sexual violence in South Sudan, but also agitate for effective redress for sexual and gender-based violence in South Sudan. So to start us off, Aluel, I'd like to ask you that, we all know that during the conflict, women and girls were significantly impacted, and sexual violence was prevalently used as a weapon of war. Now that there's relative peace in most parts of South Sudan during this transition period, what would you say is the current situation with respect to sexual violence committed against women and girls in South Sudan?
Thank you, Stella, for having us. And Stewart created a platform to discuss conflict-related sexual violence in South Sudan, especially on this important day. I would like to point out that, if there's one thing that remains persistent or constant before, during, and after conflict, it is violence against women in all its forms. And it's really important to also note that, violence against women doesn't start and end when the war starts and ends, because it's something, every conflict is sustained by feeding into already existing vulnerabilities. And violence against women, especially in South Sudan, is a structural issue that is deeply rooted in cultural structures and social norms, and everyday social norms that govern people. And so when you have something that is that deeply rooted during conflict, what often happens is it's just weaponized. It's already existing, but then it's intentionally weaponized and used during that time. The difference between that and the time after any conflict is during conflict, with the UN declaring any form of sexual violence as a weapon of war, there is an additional eye beyond the local existing structures that can hold people accountable. But then, after the conflict, when now, people are looking to the existing internal structures to address some of these issues, we're seeing a very, very sharp increase, because we have people during the war that are now back into the communities. They have arms, they're holding small arms. And if you've all been paying attention to South Sudan, a lot of the cases, especially rape cases, have been linked to armed people that are holding arms. And so that just means that even after the conflict, women are even more exposed to some of these acts because the only source they can look to for accountability is internal existing structures. And given also that the country is just transitioning from conflict to peace and trying to make a peace agreement that has been failing a couple of times work, that means that the judiciary system is quite dysfunctional. And if that is the only source of refuge for a lot of women, then I think that speaks into the vulnerability and also the fact that more women are actually exposed to sexual and gender-based violence, especially in the hands of those who still hold arms but are not necessarily active in that. So that transition, the after time for me is where I see actual work needs to be done, because then you have so many idle people that are not military, that are not active in the military field, but are back into the community and are using the powers that they have. And we all know that sexual and gender-based violence is about power. And so that, the people that become victims of that power also end up being women. So the situation hasn't changed much. And if anything, I feel like the situation actually is getting worse in terms of cases of sexual and gender-based violence in South Sudan.
Thank you, Aluel. Josephine, turning to you, you have been involved in ensuring accountability for gender-based violence in South Sudan. And we've heard from Aluel saying that the judiciary is pretty much dysfunctional. What do you see as the main hindrances to the elimination of sexual violence in South Sudan? And what opportunities do you see as existing in strengthening the protection of women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence?
Okay, so as a hindrance to sexual and gender-based violence in South Sudan, we see impunity as being the biggest hindrance to achieving accountability for survivors. Survivors draw back when they want to report cases, but when they just think about the cases or the instances of impunity and the immunity of perpetrators, then you see there is poor reporting. And then the poor reporting is coupled by the stigma and threats and fears from their neighborhoods, from their families. So this becomes a whole lot of hindrance to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. In South Sudan, we also have the absence of a safe house that could protect survivors who seek justice or who try to run away from their perpetrators. Apart from one safe house being in Torit, Eastern Equatoria State, the other 9 states do not have a safe house. So this poses a lot of challenges to survivors who are running away from their perpetrators. Stewart Women, for instance, has faced challenges of housing some of these survivors who need just one night roof over their head. And we find that we've been so scared also to do this because we do not know who is following us. So this lack of shelter and also protection for survivors is a major hindrance to achieving justice for sexual and gender-based violence survivors. And then we have the issue of political will from the authorities. For instance, in the month of April, May, due to the COVID-19 crisis, some prisoners were released, and we do not know the criteria of the release of the prisoners. So when our cases for mobile court came up, we found out that some of our perpetrators for sexual violence were missing in their prisons. And because the names of those released are not given, so we are just told that these people have been released. So we do not know the criteria that they use, because this shows the weaknesses in the political will. We also see that right now, due to the COVID-19 crisis, there is low prosecution of SGBV cases. Court sessions are going on, but in selected places. And this is due to the restrictions that have been placed by COVID-19. For South Sudan in particular, there are no virtual meetings that are being organized just like the one we are doing right now. The facilities are not there, and I'm also very sure there is no willingness to do so. We also have the GBV perspective in South Sudan, where legal services are considered to be non-essential services. This is mostly classified by the GBV subcluster. And because of this, there is low funding support for legal aid, and especially in conflict and emergencies. Legal services is put as one of the least prioritized services to SGB survivors. So this has been a big challenge to, or hindrance to, providing access to justice for SGBV survivors. We also have the issue of the operationalization of the hybrid court as provided Chapter 5 of the RHs, which is the Revitalized Agreement on the Resolution of Conflict in South Sudan. There has been a lot of also contentious conversation regarding this hybrid court. So this remains also a hindrance to survivors of SGBV. And then lastly, I would like to say that the absence of family law in South Sudan gives a lot of leeway for cultural practices to be operating, because then currently the Constitution of South Sudan guarantees a lot of power, or gives a lot of power to cultural practices for everyone to practice their culture. So until the family law is put in place, and then the family law provisions will abolish some of the practices in the existing laws, then that's when we see practical actions being taken in regard to sexual violence in South Sudan. Thanks.
Thank you, Josephine. Let's turn to you, Jackline. Jackline, you've been working very closely with survivors, a broad spectrum of survivors, including those who have experienced sexual violence. What do they want? When you meet with them, what do they tell you they want? What would they want? What form of redress would they want? Jackline, you're on mute. Jackline, unmute. Good. Speak. Jackline, are you there?
I missed you somehow.
Oh, you missed me.
My network had been poor. Yes, please.
Okay. I was asking, because you've been working very closely with survivors, what do the survivors tell you? What form of redress would they want to see?
Thank you, Stella. And thanks also for the rest of the panelists. I think this discussion is very crucial today, especially when we are talking about sexual violence in South Sudan. And one of my of sexual violence is and sometimes you see victims breaking down, and you, as also someone who is working with them, you break down. So most of the needs of the survivors rotate around their health issues and also their demand for justice. One thing from the victims is that the level of trauma they get is not only because of the incident that happened to them, but also from the communities. They become dehumanized, and that trauma that comes with it is that they have with the and the humiliation that comes with it is a lot. So we have seen some survivors who demand for more trauma counseling and healing. We had one victim who was not able to speak in one of our events, and the good thing was that we had a counselor who could help to counsel that person there and then. And then after a day, the person started speaking. So trauma healing is one of the needs and priorities that survivors may need. They need someone to listen to their story and them out with their situation. The other issue is the health needs of the survivors. Most of the survivors don't even have access to health facilities, and particularly most of these incidents happen. So you find sexual violence, and immediately this person has to come, for example, to the hospital and be helped out. But most are not there in the communities. Partial lockdown, you find that some people could not even come. And still, even if it is lifted, the economic situation in the country could not allow medical assistance. So they have to live with it. Medical support remains key priority. From their perpetrator. And I can give one example of a survivor who is blind, and this person got pregnant. And the only evidence you could get from her, the story, but she does she assume they are like this and that. So it's really difficult, especially when you're documenting their cases. And the demand for survivors is that they want to justice. And for them, peace, not justice, no peace. And the demands are clear. Like, anyway, we know that they're going to that. And some of them are consistent. Like, one to be living together now with the perpetrator. So you find that the demand for justice is also one thing that survivors keep asking for. And that is when they guarantee that there is security for them and there is peace in the country and in the community. The other thing is the humanitarian need for the survivors. And you know, most of the survivors, they have misplaced needs as well. And they cannot survive now to bring food on the table. And so when people asking, like, we keep sharing our story, but we don't have food for us, we don't have food for our children. And that is one big issue and priority that support need to be guaranteed for them. And I think mainstreaming it in humanitarian aid becomes crucial.
Okay, thank you, Jacqueline. Did we lose you or you finished? So we will move to you, Sarah. Over to you. And Sarah, you have such great experience in designing interventions that have contributed to the progress made in supporting survivors who are from the northern Uganda conflict situation, where some measure of redress for the harm suffered was obtained. Do you think there are similarities with the South Sudan context? And what successful strategies from the northern Uganda context can you share that could be useful in shaping how survivors in South Sudan access effective remedies?
Thank you very much, Stella. It's a delight to be part of this panel discussion and to learn.
Sarah. Sorry, we've lost Sarah. I think it's her connection. Before she comes back, perhaps we can come back to you, Jackline, again, on the South Sudan context, where we know that there is no specific law that is addressing gender-based violence and sexual offenses. But we know that there is a process that has been initiated that has resulted in the drafting of an anti-GBV bill, which is yet to be submitted before the National Assembly. In your opinion, what benefits would having a specific legislation that addresses sexual violence and gender-based violence introduce into the South Sudan context?
Thank you once again. Of legislation, it's important that we should have a legislation on sexual and gender-based violence. However, in its draft form, and even most of us in the civil society space and women-led human rights organizations have not seen this draft bill. And also the contribution of citizens and public in drafting of this legislation remain crucial. So despite that this legislation is at its early stage, I would say having a legislation in place will not address the issue if there is no political will, as stated by my colleague in the panel. We need political will to implement these laws. And I think sometimes when the policymakers and people in decision making, they feel like we don't have a law that penalizes this. But we have crimes. For example, we have penal code. It's very clear on sexual offenses. What we don't have is a section that talks about conflict-related sexual violence, looking at the international humanitarian laws. But we still subscribe to CEDAW, which is one critical component for protection of women. And we're also guided by the UN Security Council 1325 that talks of protection of women and provision for justice. So with all these laws, I think there should be some process that is taken deliberately to address the issues of impunity and to also bring justice to people. So much as be having a sexual-based violence law, its implementation remains critical. So without implementing this, I don't think that we can be able to say we have laws and now our problems are solved. Are perpetrators held accountable? The other issue is that we have the sexual and gender-based violence policy but it has beautifully remained on paper. It's not implemented. So we have not also had like cases where, for example, sexual has been trial and they have been. The example is in the case of the Kubi case, where we had sexual violence cases, like 6 of them, at least around the areas of Juba. And those stages without further procedures to make sure that the case is ended and perpetrators are brought into justice. The second incident is with the Terrain case, for example. The trial started with the military and it targeted only the few. I think denying justice for few is denying justice for majority. So humanitarian workers, but again, in that trial, even these perpetrators or humanitarian workers didn't get their justice, you know. So we found that the compensation that so I could is South Sudan, and then I'm seeing that as women, as men are fighting their own sexual violence in Sudan. Hello? Hello, Stella? Hello?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jackline.
Sorry.
Josephine, closely tied to, yes, thank you, Jackline. But I think we've had you till the end. Josephine, closely tied to that issue of whether legislation will bring additional benefits in the efforts towards eliminating sexual violence in South Sudan. I wonder, are there any judicial opportunities to address the endemic nature of sexual violence? Can the judicial processes offer any meaningful and far-reaching impact in the efforts to eliminate sexual violence in South Sudan?
A few judicial opportunities exist in South Sudan to address the endemic SGBV in the country. One is the presence of the SGBV court that has been established by UNDP. And I think we welcome that court. At least it will provide privacy in prosecuting cases of SGBV and also cases that are very, very sensitive to the survivors. So the presence of the SGBV court is one of the opportunities. And then we have the presence of the laws that we are using currently offer an opportunity to start with. We have the Transitional Constitution, which has gone through several amendments and maybe will continue to be amended. But we also have the Penal Code Act 2008, and then the recently developed anti-GBV bill, which is yet to go to Parliament. So these laws offer waves of opportunity, at least when cases of SGBV are brought to court nationally, these laws can be used. We are also seriously pushing for the ratification of Maputo Protocol such that we can use it for legal action locally and also regionally. And together with partners out there, we will also see how to make use of it. And then another wave of opportunity is the of the mobile court that is being supported by several actors. Some of them are in this meeting today, but also all over the country. The partners who support the mobile court are also offering a wave of opportunity to address SGBV in the country. As I talk right now, Stewart Women is prosecuting cases through the mobile court in Nimule, and we were informed by the investigator that there were 14 cases that were lined up for the coming mobile court, and 7 to 8 of those cases are rape. So you can see the gravity of the crime in the country. So having this mobile court, even in the presence of the COVID-19 crisis, is, I think, an opportunity. And also the judicial officers also agreeing to take part in this exercise when the country is being locked down and the public gatherings are being restricted is also really a plus for me. And then the human rights activists who are here in this platform, who are listening to this conversation and also out there, are also really a big opportunity to the country because they are not sleeping, they are not resting amidst the COVID-19 crisis. They are putting up their arms, they are persisting to navigate the spaces that are there to protect the women. They are reminding governments, they are reminding key stakeholders in the protection of women and girls to stand up and put up to their commitment offices. So we are coming up with new coalitions. For example, we are now a member of a coalition on work against rape, that is trying to address the increasing rates of rape in the country. So we are really trying to see there are some few opportunities and making use of the opportunities that exist.
Thank you very much, Josephine. And Sarah, it's great to have you back. Before technology let you down, I had posed a question to you, but I'll just repeat it for the benefit of the audience. Yes. Based on your experience in designing interventions that have contributed to the progress made in supporting survivors in northern Uganda, to achieve some measure of redress for the harm suffered, do you think there are any similarities with the South Sudan context? And what successful strategies can you share today with this audience that could help us in trying to shape how survivors access effective remedies in South Sudan?
Thank you, Stella. Apologies, I actually continued speaking. I didn't realize that I had gone off. It was after I'd finished that I realized that my connection had gone off. Thank you. As I had mentioned briefly, we do have quite a number of similarities with the South Sudan context, in the sense that both the armed conflicts in our two countries were characterized by various forms of sexual violence. In Uganda, particularly, the form of sexual violence that was predominant was rape, but also conjugal slavery, where many young women and girls were abducted and forced to serve as conjugal slaves to the Lord's Resistance Army, while others were subjected to various forms of sexual violence by the government of Uganda troops, which were meant to protect them. The conflict in Uganda ended in 2007. In northern Uganda, it ended in 2007. However, I'm afraid to say that several years, a decade later, there hasn't been any form of redress for victims of conflict-related sexual violence. The only attempt that we've witnessed so far is the trial of Dominic Ongwen at the International Criminal Court, who was charged with a series of sexual offenses under the Rome Statute, including forced marriage. And prior to his trial, the original indictment actually did not include any form of sexual offenses or sexual crimes. It took the prosecutor of the ICC to amend the indictment following engagement with civil society and survivor groups to investigate these crimes and to include them as charges. But at the national level, we haven't had progress in that sense, but nevertheless, there have been efforts to ensure that accountability for sexual crimes, regardless of the time lag, remains a priority in the country. One is empowering and supporting survivors, issues of ensuring that they have access to psychosocial support, health, particularly reproductive health services, to help them recover from the consequences of sexual violence that they endured. The other is working with community structures to address stigma and discrimination. As we know that one of the basic consequences of sexual violence in conflict is stigma and discrimination against survivors. And for Uganda's case, we have quite a number of survivors who returned with children born of rape, who were born as a result of the sexual violence that the survivors endured. And these children face a significant rejection by the communities, which adds a socioeconomic challenge for their mothers, who now have to find means of supporting their children and also supporting themselves. The other challenge I must add is that due to the time lag, 15 years later after the offenses have occurred, without consistent and rigorous documentation of these crimes, it is difficult to have evidence that would support accountability processes. It's therefore imperative that accountability for these crimes occurs in a very timely manner and shouldn't have to wait for a long protracted period of time. And I'm glad that in South Sudan, there are conversations about the transitional justice process, the various mechanisms under Chapter 5. It's important that a gender-inclusive approach in the implementation of these policies adopted, which centers the investigation and prosecution of sexual crimes, but providing survivor-centered support and response and assistance to victims, including holistic and comprehensive reparations that address the legacies of sexual violence that victims endure.
Thank you, Sarah. You as well. Having had Sarah's intervention and insights, and I know one of the things that you're very passionate about is trying to address the socio-cultural beliefs that have led to a lot of stigmatization and curtail the full enjoyment of rights for women and girls in South Sudan. What practical insights can you offer on how some of these barriers that women and girls are facing in South Sudan can be effectively addressed within the South Sudan context?
I think one of the things that we often underestimate is how social norms impact every work that we do, especially when it comes to work around women's rights specifically. And I think this is one of the issues that South Sudan is battling with. And like Jackline mentioned, that sometimes we have the laws, and when we're thinking of solutions, we're always thinking of what laws do we need to put in place to be able to address some of these issues. And on paper, we have all the documents that we need to actually address this, but we often miss the link of the social norms and how that feeds into everything else that is made. And I think for me, that has a lot to do with the attitudes that people have, the way people are nurtured, the way people grow up, and the beliefs that people hold, especially about women and women's position in society. Violence against women is a very...
Well, we are losing you a bit. So I think just hold your mic a bit and avoid me.
Okay.
So that we hear everything.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay. And I think it's important that we remember that, when we talk about this, it's a patriarchal violence that women are facing in South Sudan. And when we have a constitution, a part of the constitution that also protects the rights for cultural, for ethnic and communities to practice their cultural beliefs and raise their children in ways that are in line with their culture, it somehow, outdoes, even if you've already stated a list of things that you consider harmful cultural practices, that somehow gives people a pass to think that, this is my culture, and the constitution protects that particular culture. And I think for me, the insight I would like to center on, where I know that we have the power as women, is to fight the culture of shame. Because shame culture is what has enabled the society, it's what has enabled women to continue to not speak up on issues that are affecting them, because they've been always told to be silent. And I think we have an opportunity as this generation that is raising the next generation to break that cycle and end shame culture, to say that it's okay for a woman to come up and speak about her abuse, and have society not look at her as the problem, as the person that carries the burden for coming out to speak. And I think I'm slowly starting to see a breakthrough with this shame culture. I'm seeing a lot of young women, especially, using their online spaces to break this culture. And the past 3 days, especially on Twitter and Facebook, this hashtag that was created, South Sudanese survivors, and we're basically saying, listening to a South Sudanese survivor. These young women are coming up with their stories. They're just sharing that and naming names. They're not just telling stories, but they're putting names to their stories. And it's something that South Sudan had not experienced in a very long time, that people are calling out even abuses that have happened within a family context. And these young girls are coming out and telling their stories. Maybe at this particular moment, people are not seeking for justice, but I think it adds such a big difference to just get that weight off your chest, to just say it out there, and then leave the rest of the process to the healing. So I'm seeing a very, very big insight and a breakthrough, and taking power back from abusers, because once you carry that burden, you've given the entire power to that abuser. He can come back and do it over and over again, because he knows that there is nothing you're going to do. And I think with this new era of young people naming and shaming their abusers, young people saying, you know what, I'm just going to tell my story as it is, and see what happens from there. I think it is a starting point for South Sudan. And I think focusing on creating spaces where people can share these stories, just create spaces for people to speak, for people to just talk, to just acknowledge that even sexual harassment is an issue that should be punishable by law. It is a crime, and to also try to challenge narratives that reduce all forms of sexual violence to rape, because when we only focus on the context of rape as the main form of violence, we somehow undermine all these other forms that eventually lead to rape as one of the issues that South Sudan is battling right now. So that for me is a very big breakthrough, and I think it's a big opportunity also for South Sudan, because we've been fighting a lot of these crimes that haven't been actually recognized as problems, and just starting from a place where people step back and say, let's just point these things out. What actually amounts to violence against me, against my body, as a woman, as someone that was raised to think a man that has paid dowry for you has a right and access to your body at all times. To start to step back and say, wait, there's such a thing as as marital rape. And I think these are things that young people are starting to open their eyes to, that were clearly hidden in culture. And I think breaking away from that will give us an opportunity to look at everything completely from a human rights-based perspective that is not directly linked to what culture says or how you were raised as a young woman, or as a submissive young girl who thinks you have no control over your own body.
Thank you very much, Aluel. I think let's turn back again to Sarah. And Aluel touched on it, the issue of working with survivors, ensuring that you're building a community of survivors where they get safe spaces and they're able to work together and heal. And I know for the Northern Ugandan context, that was something significant. And you've mentioned earlier that there hasn't been much accountability for survivors from the Northern Uganda conflict who experienced sexual violence. But there's been quite a significant lessons that we've been able to learn from how survivors were able to organize in that context. And I was just wondering whether you could share a few insights that can also help, because Aluel says that's one of the things that they are trying to look into, and it's something that is growing within the South Sudanese context.
Let me unmute. Indeed, thank you, Stella. One of the things we have learned in this process is that, as I mentioned earlier, that where there is very limited political will to pursue accountability for these crimes, it's important to mobilize, empower survivors to maintain the fight and to be willing to go the long way of pursuing and demanding accountability. And this is what happened in Northern Uganda, where we had hundreds of young women and from captivity returned to their communities with no form of assistance whatsoever from the state, facing pervasive discrimination and rejection because, one, as we know, the stigma, the blame culture, whereby victims are blamed for what happened to them instead of blaming the perpetrators of these crimes, and the normalization itself of sexual violence. So what happened is we noticed a strength in peer-to-peer engagement, where survivors would organize, share their stories, share the strategies for resilience, develop their own strategies for engaging the state and demanding for accountability. And eventually we had groups of survivors, of over 500 survivors, such as the Women's Advocacy Network, who were able to sit collectively and in their own language with very minimum support of civil society to lay down their demands for accountability. They eventually presented these demands in a form of a petition to Parliament, and Parliament passed a unanimous motion recognizing the need to provide gender-sensitive reparations, putting in place a gender-sensitive reparations program. Yes, of course, the state response has been slow, but for the quest for accountability requires that survivors and activists remain committed to engaging and to demanding and exerting pressure, knowing that it will take a while, but it will eventually happen. As I mentioned already, Dominic, there were no charges of sexual violence, But because of the work that had been done to highlight that this is not going to go away as a silent crime, it must be addressed. These charges were included. Similarly, in the case of Thomas Koyelo, the initial indictment did not have any single charge of sexual violence. But again, the survivors and activists were able to persuade the prosecutor. So supporting victims organizing is critical, and creating spaces where their voices could be amplified and where they could actually articulate in their own terms what they need to see done to repair the harm that they suffered and to restore their rights. But this also is critical in tackling stigma in communities where suddenly the people that are being victimized, being rejected by society, their humanity is recognized. They're recognized as persons who contribute to society, persons who are victimized not due to their own fault, but due to the failure of the state to protect them. Therefore, I think it's important that supporting victims to organize as a long-term strategy of ensuring that accountability for these crimes is achieved. And we've seen victims actually not only influencing domestic agenda, but at the international agenda. The norms at the international level have been significantly influenced by victims across the world, victims of sexual violence, organizing and shaping and sharing why it is critical for sexual conflict to remain a priority issue that must be addressed.
Thank you, Sarah. We will stop there, and then we will open up this conversation to the plenary. And if you have any question, I can't see any questions in the chat. We had indicated you can either put your question in the chat or you can raise up your hand, and then we will be able to give you the platform to be able to ask any question, any clarifications, any insights that you might have. Yes, you can raise your hand, Lillian. So do you want to speak? Lillian, do you want to speak? Okay. Can you open up for Lillian? We are opening. Yeah. You can unmute, Lillian.
Yeah, hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for organizing this beautiful, very, very educative and informative panel. My question is to, I think Josephine or Jackline, one of them mentioned that there is a SGBV court in South Sudan, in which I am not really sure if it's functioning. So if one of the speakers could highlight more about whether the SGBV court is actually working in South Sudan, and if it's not working, what are the challenges?
Thank you, Lillian, for your question. This is Josephine. I mentioned about the presence of the SGBV court being an opportunity for judicial work in the country. And like I said before, this court has been established by UNDP. And its operationalization is a conversation of its own. And I'm not seeing any reports or work that the court is doing. So I also myself haven't investigated the reasons why the court is not operating or functioning up to this time. But there is a presence of the court in the country.
Yeah, if I can add my voice to the question of Lillian. This court was established, I think it's now 1 year ago, and UNDP, UNMI supported it for the government to start operationalizing it. So it's a national, however, what is missing is the starting this court. And I think it's not operational because of lack of funds, because probably UNDP, UNMIS, and the rest of the donors, they have poured in money to establish that court. And I think it still goes back to the question of the I remember the court was launched. going to look into issues of human rights, including even broader cases conflict related. So I think it just stalled there. It has not moved forward. So one thing will be for civil society activists, human rights defenders to start pushing this court to become one of our staff had conversation the judges for that court. I think one of the issues they raise is in terms of their capacity and understanding of sexual and gender-based violence issues. And as you know, is judges is where custom law legal and then needs change. And I think helping to build the capacity of these judges to understand the issues around sexual violence and, for example, documenting and prosecuting sexual violence victims for the judges becomes important. Like, how can they protect them as witnesses? How can they handle them? How can they document cases of sexual violence becomes critical for their start of the work. So these are some of the issues that they raise. I think the capacity building issue remains crucial. But also when we are talking about these international crimes, I think also there is need to have like a series of mentorship and trainings for these judges to understand international crimes and human rights issues.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I think there's an intervention by Roslyn, and which is interesting, also on the SGBV court. But before perhaps I give Roslyn an opportunity to address this if she wants to speak, I would want to just perhaps ask a couple of questions. During this discussion, from yourself, Jacqueline, Josephine, we've heard about you saying that the problem in South Sudan is not a lack of laws, which is true. But I think also one of the things that I wanted to give my insights on is the fact that there is no specific legislation that specifically sets out how to address the issues of sexual violence and sexual and gender-based violence and sexual offenses has been seen to be a hindrance in other countries, because when you look at the penal code, it's not sufficient. Jacqueline, you've just talked about the issue of judges and them needing to be supported to understand better how to deal with issues of protection issues for some of the survivors and even witnesses in some of these cases. Those are not covered by the penal code, and neither are they covered by any specific law in South Sudan. And in situations where you don't have specific laws that deal with some of the challenges that arise when you're dealing with unique cases like sexual and gender-based violence cases, then you face a challenge in terms of how well and effectively these cases can be investigated and tried. And so I think there is value in having some additional laws, while also acknowledging that laws will not implement themselves, and they won't be effective if there is no political will to actually ensure that that they are actually offering the protection that they ought to. Having said that, I think if Roslyn says that the court is functioning, although not officially opened yet, which is a bit confusing, and she says that it has handled 38 juvenile cases. But my question is, are these juvenile cases in relation to sexual and gender-based violence, or they're just in relation to other offenses, juvenile offenses committed by minors? Having said that, also, I think there's been also issues around whether this court was supposed to be addressing juvenile cases, because I think in the initial objective of this court was to handle only SGBV cases, and then there's been an additional mandate of handling juvenile cases, and I think cases that relate to wildlife crimes. And so I think it would be good to hear from Roslyn a clarification as to whether the court is actually officially handling sexual and gender-based violence cases. Roslyn, are you there? Okay, You're muted, but if you want, please raise your hand. We will give you an opportunity to just provide a bit of clarity on what you've posted on the chat. I'll move to a question that has been asked by Juan Rachel, who is asking whether the panelists can provide some insights on the implementation of the National Action Plan in relation to the Women, Peace and Security resolution. What has been the progress or using it as a tool to address sexual and gender-based violence? If you have experience around this and updated information around this, Jackline, Josephine, and Aluel, over to you. You're all on mute. Josephine, would you want to address the question?
Yeah.
I think Aluel can go.
Okay.
So I think just like many other trusts, and I think that we have a task force that has been trying from the civil society space, that has been trying to follow through with seeing through the implementation of the National Action Plan. And I think I don't want to repeat what Jackie already said, because sometimes we have these documents on paper, but when we see the progress that gets to actually be made, one of the biggest challenges we're facing as a country is we sign things regionally, internationally, but when it comes to actually embedding them domestically, there's always a gap right there. It just looks like ticking a box to say, South Sudan has signed this, South Sudan has done this. But for some of these things to actually move, it's not just about signing it, it's not just about developing strategies, but there has to be a budget allocated to see through the activities or the programs, policies that need to be under this action plan. One of the biggest challenges that South Sudan has constantly had, and I don't think it's only in South Sudan, is the fact that conversations around gender equality and issues to do with gender-based violence usually get the minimal national budget support. And a lot of the work that people do end up depending on donation, depending on funding. And you see that in the case of South Sudan, the people that are trying to move the National Action Plan are international partners, and if the spirit of the National Action Plan is not embedded nationally, it's the ownership of it, that comes with commitment to see this through in terms of budget as well, to make sure that all of these are unfolding. It often just, remains in spaces with those that can access the funding to be able to move that. And I think this is something that South Sudan has struggled with for quite a long time. And I think, for us to see change, there actually has to be resources committed to do the work. So most of this has pretty much remained on paper, and a lot of the push has been from the civil society, human rights and government organizations that are trying to push the agenda forward. But there is very, very minimal commitment, especially in terms of resources from the government, which should be the body that is sitting and spearheading some of these national action plans. And maybe if Jackie has something to add, because I'm sure at least on the task force, the civil society with other that have been trying to push the national action plan forward, but resources to actually see it through. And again, it comes down to political will, because I think if you don't have the political will, it's not going to be on the budget priority if you're making national budget. That continues to come up. A lot of efforts on just only sexual and gender-based violence, but addressing issues of gender as a whole complementing Sudan.
Thank you. The next question to the panelists is what kind of efforts can be undertaken by the different actors to enable victims of sexual violence to engage with the CTRH and the CRA? Jackline or Josephine?
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
I think in regards to victims' engagement with CRA, one of the things is to create awareness for is and what compensation and reparations authority mean to them. And I think this should be done extensively so that women become central in engaging in these processes and also making sure their needs and priorities are addressed. Like if we are talking about the CRA, it's something close to the needs of the victims, as I stated earlier on. And then when we need to have a robust reconciliation and truth-telling of what exactly happened, and then the victim should have a platform to share their experiences. And as Aluel say, this generation is breaking the silence. So can we have a platform and a space where victims can break their silence and where perpetrators can also be exposed and they ask for forgiveness from victims? And people move forward as a country in a cleaner way, not the same way where we have been. The other issue is to strengthen the existing agenda desks. We know that there are agenda desks in our justice, in our rule of law and law enforcement agencies, like the police. They have gender desks, and those gender desks, they look at issues of women. And I could say sexual and gender-based violence need to be one of the core for these gender desks, such that it becomes gender sensitive and taking into needs of women and girls who are victims of sexual violence. And I think also these gender desks within our national defense forces, and women are also sitting in those gender desks. So I could say that we need to empower them and support those gender desks so that they can be able to document and also pursue justice from their own institutions for these sexual and gender-based violence victims. Also, what to be done in light of the broader transitional justice is to ensure that the process is citizen-driven. It's not driven by probably elites who may not be able to reflect the needs of the victims and the people who have suffered the conflict. So this calls for consultations with victims, so that every process, every legislation that is going to be drafted, including even for the hybrid court,
We've lost you, Jacqueline.
Conflict.
Stella, if I could just add a few points to what Jackie has mentioned, and thank you for that question, Chris. It's critical. We'll start from the basics. Information. To what extent do those who are meant to benefit from this process have access to information that they can easily understand and digest? It doesn't have to be this very complicated. Just don't give them chapter 5 as it is and tell them, well, you're entitled to this. So providing information in a culturally sensitive manner that enables victims understand their rights and entitlements in the process and how they can participate is very critical. Then the other is with regard to consultations, and thank you for raising that, Jackie. That is fundamental. Consultations by persons who have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to conduct consultations among survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. This requires creating safe spaces where survivors can articulate what must be done for them to feel comfortable to share their stories at the CTRH or to participate in a reparations process. What are those priorities that must be considered? We've seen this approach, it has worked in multiple contexts, including Sierra Leone, where there was recognition that survivors were not coming forward to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. therefore think it's important that whatever measures are designed, they must take into account that create safe spaces, give victims the confidence to come forward, respect their privacy, but importantly, they are conducted in a manner that does not contribute to further harm. For example, a manner that could generate stigma or a manner that could generate re-traumatization.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that intervention and that addition to Jackline's point. I think I'm trying to look and see which was the next question. Yes, the next question was posed to Josephine. Jame, I think if you want to speak, you'll indicate in the chat and then I will schedule you. Yeah, so let me just ask a question to Josephine that is already here and then you speak after. Thank you. So Josephine, there's a question that's addressed specifically to you where you're asked to share some of the best practices and lessons learned from the safe houses in Torit that was established in Torit, and so that people can understand better how the possibility of establishing other safe houses around the country. And then you can also comment on which organization would be best to take lead in the development of this. And should the international community support this? And if so, how? Including with what funding is available. You're on mute, Josephine. Unmute. Yes.
Thank you for the question. In my presentation, I did say that there are not many safe houses in the country. The one I know is that in Torit. And I would like to say that I don't have much experience with working with the Torit court, but the Torit shelter. But what I know is, with my experience with working with survivors in Juba, we have received survivors from all parts of the country except from Torit. So the lesson I learned from there is that due to the presence of the safe house in Torit, survivors easily go visit the safe house and they are accommodated there, as opposed to the other parts of the country where a survivor walks all the way from Bor, all the way from Nimule and all the way from Western Equatoria. They are running to Juba, and then they reach here. They visit the gender office, and gender office calls us and to keep them. So basically, that is what I've learned, that due to that presence of the shelter in Torit, the survivors have where to go for protection. So in terms of which organization should lead in the development of this, by July 2019, the then Minister of Gender, Child and Social Welfare, Madam Awut, who expressed that there is presence of, there is a guideline for safe houses that has been developed by the ministry. So there's a guideline in place, but how to make use of the guideline and also to raise awareness of the guideline has not been done. And she had informed us to construct one in Capoeira, and I had told her that this will really depend on funding. But I think who owns or who runs the safe house? Are you listening? Yes, so who runs the safe house? It should be in the hands of Ministry of Gender with the other partners who can support the safe house. But also one thing that I have learned is the safe house does not need to be known to many people, because the survivors who are kept there need their privacy to be kept, and also it's not to be accessible to every other person. So that is what I know about it. And then the funding can come from the partners, because I'm well aware that the government does not have the capacity to fund this. But at least what I now know is they have come up with a guideline to run a safe house. So I think it's good we make follow up on that if there is a political will to support and run. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Josephine. Would you know who runs the safe house in Torit? Which organization? Josephine?
It's Ministry of Gender, Child and Social Welfare.
Okay, thank you. I think, Jame, you can pose your question. Or insight.
No, I just wanted to thank you very much. Hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, proceed.
Very well.
To take, because I respond to the question of the process. I think last year we Institute for Security, and we tried to gather citizen perception on the overall there seems to be, first of all, very little information broadly, like what Sarah said, very little information in terms of what actually Chapter 5 is all about and what transitional justice is all about. Now, that means that we still have a very long way of ensuring that while we try to bring victims on board and citizens on board to be able to engage in these processes, we still have the milestone of having to ensure that we know information about the process. Number two is that even up to now, I think we still, there has been a very serious resentment of the justice process, and that the narrative to probably candidate is the narrative that transitional justice itself is a foreign agenda, and then arrest few here and there for purposes of overthrowing the government. Now, that narrative is very dangerous in the sense that even when we begin to hear the CRA or even about the hybrid court, there is already a cloud of resistance being established by those that would work together supposedly, especially in the states, the police, the judiciary, and so on, to an extent that the environment actually the victims becomes extremely very serious. The third issue that came out directly from the victim is that what kind of commission are we going to have? I think there is pessimism in regards to the kind of commission that we're going to have and who are going to be the commissioners. One of the that they actually have that there seems not to be very clear measures that would be able to guarantee their participation, either to testify or to ask questions of what exactly happened. And therefore, civil society, we have always been saying that while we pursue the establishment of the CTRH, we must take into account that the commissioners, and indeed one of the 7 commissioners also, must be an expert that can be able to handle sexual and gender-based violent issues, somebody that handle fundamental questions that still keep coming, and together with all the activists here in support of experts in the region, able to create an environment to build a confidence for people to engage in the transitional justice mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Jame. I will move to the next question that was from Agatha. After decades of sexual violence in South Sudan, it's become normalized with reports indicating that could have been contributed to the increase of domestic violence within communities, and especially against women and girls. Are there programs to raise awareness against SGBV within the communities as a protection/deterrent mechanism? Are there any organizations or institutions working at the community level that are trying to drive the issue of protection and deterrence against SGBV?
I think
yes, please proceed.
Yeah, I think a lot of the civil society, especially women-led organizations, focus at grassroots levels, and there's a lot of ongoing work. Can you hear me?
It's quite a bit on and off, but try. I'll let you know.
Oh, okay. I think a lot of the work that women's rights civil society, especially women's rights organizations, are doing is focused on the grassroots level. And I think for South Sudan, a lot of the work is actually on awareness raising, because we're still in a place where a lot of people actually haven't acknowledged most of these forms of sexual and gender-based violence as problems that actually need to be addressed. And so there's a lot of effort on awareness raising, and there's also a lot of work around creating women's networks that build protection. And I think there's also one organization that I know, it's international, but they have a lot of work on the grassroots, that the Nonviolent Peace Force, and they also have the women protection teams where they train particular women on, picking up the role of protection of other women. And a lot of that is centered around basically looking out for each other, identifying issues at community level. And a lot of the women's rights organizations are also trying to work with the local justice structures, the chiefs at the communal level, in Payams, administrators, to start to also have them realize some of these issues. And I think Josephine can speak to that, because she also does a lot of work in collaboration, trying to address issues with chiefs as the people that are often, given cases around sexual and gender-based violence to address. So I think there's a lot of ongoing work, awareness raising, ongoing work at community levels that is geared towards just having people to see the problem, And I think once we're able to have people recognize these problems, we're starting to see, people speaking up and reporting, because now they understand that this is not normal. This is actually a crime that needs to be addressed. So I think that is as a result of the intensive awareness raising programs that different women's organizations and civil society organizations are doing at grassroots level, and people are starting to actually slowly begin to speak up on some of these issues.
I would also add, okay, so I do concur with Aluel totally, but would like to add that civil society have also gone ahead to establish women and girls friendly spaces in communities where women and girls can engage themselves at their convenient time, and it's a space for them to just learn experiences that each of them are facing, but also other issues that are coming up that is going, and they have those spaces there to just have conversations. So I think civil society is doing a lot of work at the grassroots. There's also awareness raising that they're doing home to home. There's home to home awareness raising. This is specifically down to reach out to those who are sick, the elderly, breastfeeding mothers, those who cannot take a step to go out to the public places and attend to public events. And now also this home-to-home support is more critical at this time of COVID-19, where going out in public places and also public gathering is prohibited. So we have been working with the caseworkers and community paralegals who visit some of these homes to raise awareness on SGBV prevention and some of the response mechanisms, but also disseminate referral pathways. Aluel asked me to mention about working with chiefs. It's true, Stewart Women has close to 8 years of experience working with chiefs, whom we call family courts. And in these family courts, it's a mixture of traditional chiefs and women leaders who resolve expediently family-related GBV issues. And also we put it as an initiative or as a formal establishment, so that, because if you compare these chiefs or the family courts with the other traditional courts, the other traditional courts charge fees to handle cases related to GBV for women, but that we ask them not to charge monies to women who report their cases. And so they have to handle it without charging any fees to the survivors who report the cases. And this is because we do facilitate them monthly. So we also, because of that, we also receive monthly reports from them to know what cases were reported and how many were successfully resolved and how they were resolved. Thanks.
Thank you. Because we are running out of time, we've actually run out of time, I'll just take one last question that was specifically addressed to you, Sarah, where you are required to explain a bit more how come a domestic case is being tried at the International Criminal Court in reference to the case that you spoke about earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I'll try and be brief. And with your indulgence, the question by Chris. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over international crimes that may be committed or that are committed in a domestic setting. So for Uganda's case, for example, there were crimes, that's crimes against humanity and war crimes that were committed during the LRA conflict. And Uganda, being a state party to the Rome Statute, referred this situation to the International Criminal Court, which conducted investigations and found that crimes had been committed that meet its jurisdictional standards, and therefore it initiated. Sexual violence crimes, yes, were committed as part of the conflict, but they constituted crimes against humanity. In other words, as part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilian populations. So it's not enough for sexual violence to have occurred, but it must be linked to a widespread or systematic attack against civilian populations. And that's how the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. And I believe, and I will be corrected, that once the statute of the hybrid court is adopted and it has jurisdiction over international crimes, then that could be the same standard that's applied, whereby sexual violence could be prosecuted at the hybrid court if it meets that threshold of either as a crime against humanity or as a war crime, if at all, actually, if there's genocide, which I really doubt, but it must meet the standard definition of what constitutes an international crime. And then to Chris's question, which I think is a great question of how pursuing, differentiating the push for accountability for conflict-related sexual violence and sexual violence resulting from the general collapse of law and order. So I will I'll start from a general perspective and then narrow it down. From a general perspective, we know that the common strand that drives sexual violence in whatever context is impunity, whereby this repeated normalization of sexual abuse where perpetrators are not held accountable, and the culture of shame and stigma. Therefore, when it comes to accountability, it's necessary, regardless of whether it is conflict-related or as a result of law and order, that there are effective investigations and prosecutions and spaces where victims can come forward. Now, going back to the technical aspect, obviously there is a distinction. Conflict-related, usually we've seen it's sexual violence used as a tool of war, but again, it meets a threshold of international crimes. Oftentimes, conflict-related sexual violence is prosecuted as an international crime. Whereas sexual violence, as we are seeing, the continuum, and this is one thing I want to emphasize, that sexual violence is part of a continuum which happens prior conflict, is exacerbated during conflict, and continues in post-conflict. And in South Sudan's case, we're seeing this continuation because of the breakdown of rule of law and order, a weak capacity of judicial mechanisms to investigate and prosecute these crimes. Therefore, it's important, in my view, that as we focus on strengthening the response to conflict-related sexual violence, prosecuting it as an international crime, it's necessary to strengthen domestic abilities of investigating and prosecuting these crimes, even as domestic crimes, as we could mention that. So yes, so that there are distinctions, but it's important not to lose sight of the broader perspective, which is effective investigations and prosecutions as a key to addressing that pins these violations.
Thank you, Sarah. I will then now just come to all of you, the panelists, for one final word that you might be having or insight as to how we can move this engagement further and how we can better advocate for accountability or ensure that we are also engaging in ensuring that we are contributing to the elimination of sexual violence within the South Sudanese context. I'll start with you, Josephine. Final word. Please unmute. Aluel? Oh, okay, thank you, Josephine.
A final word on overcoming the legacies in sexual violence and the conflict and conflict is for us to work closely with the judiciary in terms of building their capacity, engaging them in meetings, and also monitoring and evaluating their work to understand what is working well and what is not working well, where are the barriers, and also to ensure that the work they are doing is put on record for future use. For instance, in terms of developing precedents on women's rights cases, is something that we need to invest in terms of working with the judiciary. So I think we have to keep very close to the judiciary if we have to see the legacies of sexual violence go down. Thanks.
Thank you. Aluel?
For me, my last words is I think it's important, given the context of and history of South Sudan, that every work that we do is trauma-informed and not just a work around LGBT, but all kinds of community intervention, because I think there's a lot that is deeply rooted in the traumatic events that people have experienced in South Sudan, and I think that is really key. And the other second thing I really want us to focus on is the agency to the need to give women back their agency. I know sometimes the urge to want to focus on engaging men in some of these conversations is very high, but I think it's about time that we also, put in more effort into giving back women their agency and to have their voice, to be able to stand up for themselves. And that will do a lot to do with people, individuals understanding what consent is in detail, because I think that is one piece that we need to really center in conversations around having women understand their rights. I think there is no freedom for women in any context until we're able to have complete control over our own bodies as human beings and decide what happens with our own individual bodies. So I think that for me is really, really key in moving this conversation forward.
Thank you. Sarah?
Good. Thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I just have a few concluding remarks. The first is as we celebrate today, the day of the elimination of sexual violence and conflict, we need to see a deliberate effort to have a positive downstream effect of the progressive gains that are happening at the international level to the domestic level. Because we've seen so much progress at the international level, but very limited progress has been made at the domestic level.
Sorry, as Sarah perhaps rejoins, maybe we can hear from you, Jackline.
Hello?
Stella? Hello?
Oh, Sarah, you're back. Okay. Sarah, your connection is a bit weak. I don't know, you dropped off, but.
Okay. Yes. So what I was saying is
Jackline, go on. Jackline, go on.
In my conclusion, I'll say that we need to have more awareness raising on the rights of women and girls and on sexual and gender-based.
Is it us? It's us.
Particularly community leaders, so that the approach to addressing gender-based violence comes from the ground, and then we can now pursue for justice at the higher level. And finally, I would say that gender-based violence in South Sudan is a pandemic as well, because everywhere women are sexually assaulted and they suffer rape. So I could say that the quest for justice needs to be amplified. And at our various levels, we need to be advocating and supporting justice for victims.
Okay. I hope you can hear me, Stella. I'm seeing in the chat, everyone says they can hear me, and my connection doesn't seem to have gone off. But we need to see a positive downstream of the progressive gains at the international level in relation to the investigation and prosecution of sexual crimes happening at the domestic level. I think we are noticing there's still that gap. It's not in considering that sexual violence is part of a continuum. In other words, it happens in peacetime and in conflict. We need to see accountability at both levels, in that accountability during peacetime, but also accountability for conflict-related sexual crimes. And then lastly, on the issue of having legislation and setting up courts, we've been talking about this. This is not adequate. It must be accompanied by one, adequate budgetary allocations. To demonstrate political will, there must be adequate budgetary allocations for investigation, for prosecution, for protective measures for victims and reparations. There should be continuous capacity development programs for those who are involved. It's not enough to set up a court. It's not enough to have in place laws. It's important that the people responsible for the enforcement of these laws have the knowledge, capacity, and attitude to do so. And finally, tied into that, especially in contexts is unlikely to happen soon, collection, documentation, and preservation of forensic evidence for sexual violence is necessary. And that should be an area, especially where there's a gap for accountability. And obviously, a survivor-centered approach should inform all these processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope my internet disappoints me that you can all hear. I wanted to just say that, I mean, as evidenced in the chat, it's been such a great meeting. I want to thank the panelists to whom we reached out with very short notice, and they were very willing to come on board, and they've been very gracious and great. And for sure, they are the experts on these issues, and we've seen and we've heard from the conversation that we've had. But what is important is for me to just say that the thinking behind this is that we're going to organize a series of these types of webinars more of a thinking session. From this particular one, we will try and synthesize some of the great ideas that have come from this conversation, because they are going to also inform not only our work as law, but our work as a collective in trying to ensure that we are pushing for accountability, but we're also improving the lives of these survivors and those who've been affected by these crimes, their lived realities. We've had many of them also have issues in relation to livelihood. They're raising issues around livelihood. So just having a more of a holistic approach to ensure that even as we push for justice and accountability, we are ensuring that their current lived realities are also improving. The issue of survivor associations, how can we support them more to ensure that they are also more organized, have the skill set to be able to organize and demand within their own terms, justice in their own terms, because the form of justice that often, the way justice is viewed in many contexts when we talk about justice, a lot of people just think about the criminal accountability process, but there are many forms of justice. And no survivor is the same to the other. There is no homogeneous application or homogeneous needs when it comes to survivors. So we will put this together. We will circulate the notes on what has come out of this, or in the form of a communique. And then we will organize other topical and relevant webinars that will help us keep synthesizing this and come up with more effective and practical strategies as to how we can engage. So you keep hearing from us, you keep hearing from the partners that we work with in South Sudan. And I thank all of you for having been patient. I know some have had to drop off, but it's been great having you on this webinar, and it's been such a great engagement from all those who spoke, and even from all those who just put their comments on the chat. Thank you very much, and we've come to a close of today's webinar. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you.